Hi, this is Kalsifakowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at how the young United States is going to scrap its Articles of Confederation and replace it with a new constitution. And if you recall, the Articles of Confederation were highly problematic in so many respects, as you had no national figurehead, you had no national court system, you had no national power to tax, and certainly this is, not going to make a heck of a lot of sense practically. Now, of course, to the states, they just got out of a quote-unquote bad relationship with Great Britain, so they're going to give more power to the states and the national government. But at the end of the day, when you look at this practically, the Articles of Confederation are doomed to fail, and we see this particularly with Shays' Rebellion. So we're going to fast forward and look at the Constitutional Convention as well as how the country is going to move forward. And we'll come back to this next slide just a little bit later with respect to Washington's farewell address. But before we get there, let's fast forward to the Constitutional Convention. And after we've scrapped the articles, we are going to have the country come together in Philadelphia in 1787, and they're going to debate with this new constitution how much power should be given to the states versus the national government. How much power should be given to the big states versus small states? How should they be represented? And how do we even begin to represent all the diverse interests from, Maine, or present-day Maine? Of course, at that point, that was Massachusetts, all the way down to Georgia. So certainly a number of problems they had to sort out. And ultimately, what they're going to come out with is a framework that divides the power between the national and state government. It does not mean that the central government gets all the power. The states are going to get powers through what are known as reserved powers in the 10th Amendment. You're also going to see the separation of powers with the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Of course, they're each going to have their own realm for power, and they can each check one another in the event that one oversteps its bounds. So that's going to be very important. And of course, one of the big issues is, as I said earlier, is how much power and representation should a big state get versus a small state? Well, small states want their power. Big states want more power. So how do we resolve this? Well, one of the earlier plans representing smaller states was the New Jersey's plan. This is preferred by the small states. It includes 3 branches. And the big idea here, too, is that it could collect taxes. That's actually very big because for a government to work, you need money to some extent. And the hallmark part about this plan is that each state is just going to get 1 vote. So it's equal. And it's also only going to have 1 chamber of Congress. And this is what you know as a unicameral legislature. So there's just 1 house. The competing plan for this is from Virginia, representing bigger states. And again, you do have your legislative, executive, judicial branches included. And taxes could be collected. Again, very important. The difference here is that you're going to have a bicameral legislature with both houses being proportional. So the more population that you have, the more representation that you're going to get. So of course, bigger states are going to like this. So what is fair? Well, ultimately, you're going to merge the best aspects of the New Jersey plan and the best aspects of the Virginia plan, and you get what we have today through the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, where you have a legislature with 2 houses, right? So 1 house is going to be our House of Representatives, which is going to be based on population. So, big states are happy there. But then the other chamber is going to be the Senate, and every state gets 2 senators. And of course, that's equal across the board. So even if you have 5 people, you get 2 senators. And if your state has 100 million, you still get 2 senators. So that is how it's going to be. Now, how do we count slaves? Well, we're going to come up with this very arcane fraction that slaves are going to be counted as 3/5 of a person. Remember, you need the South on board with this new constitution. So you have to provide some type of representation. Even though slaves had 0 rights, they were still counted as people. So the difficult part here of the American Revolutionary War wasn't really winning the war. It's putting this new government together. And, getting to have the other states on board and ratifying. And when you ratify something, you make it legal. So they had to advocate for, in particular, the founding fathers had to advocate that the states should, buy into this new, constitution. And they needed a minimum of 9 states. So you already have states from the get-go, like Rhode Island, saying, no way. Under the Articles of Confederation, I was doing really well. And if we go back to one of the previous slides that I had with respect to the Federalist Papers, these are going to be instrumental in terms of persuading states that you don't need to worry. We have this awesome checks and balances. We have this federal republic where you have powers given to the national government. We have powers given to the state government. So you're not going to have one government dominating over another. So you see that in Federalist 14 with respect to federalism. And then you also see with Federalist 51 in particular that it's advocating for a three-branch government, separation of powers. And you see that it's very Enlightenment heavy. You bring in ideas from Locke, consent of the governed, and Montesquieu especially with our three branches. And we saw this earlier too, not only with Common Sense and Thomas Paine, but also with the Declaration of Independence. So the Enlightenment is absolutely a very big factor because you have the revolution in the mind during the build up to the Revolutionary War, and then you also have it in the mind as well when you're crafting this new Constitution. So the Federalist Papers are going to be quite instrumental because you have two factions that are going to emerge. You have the Federalists who support a Constitution where more power is given to the central government, and less power is going to be given to the states. But again, the states still have a role. On the flip side here, you have the anti-federalists who are really doubtful about having a strong central government. And they're going to say, we're not going to ratify this document until we actually have specific protections. And that's exactly how you get the Bill of Rights. They are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, and they are going to address the fears of the Constitution to these anti-federalists, saying you do not need to worry, you have protections. So, for example, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion. You have the Privacy Amendment of the Fourth Amendment. You even have the Eighth Amendment that's going to protect you from cruel and unusual punishment. You have the Sixth Amendment, which is going to give you the right to hire a lawyer in your defense and confront your accusers and have an impartial jury. I mean, that is big. Absolutely, that is big. So that's going to eventually lead to the ratification of the Constitution. And in our first election in 1788, you're going to see, well, Washington is going to be elected. Now, some wanted Washington in particular to become a king. I mean, it's quite ironic that you just fought a war against a king, and now you're thinking about putting Washington in as a potential king. I mean, that's how highly thought of that Washington was at this point. And when you look at this, you see it's a unanimous electoral college, and you might wonder why were the North Carolina, in Rhode Island in particular, in New York not participating. Well, New York did not appoint its electors at this point. In Rhode Island, in North Carolina did not ratify it at this point, so they did not participate. But you see, this is the only U.S. election, to my knowledge, where it was unanimous for one person, like Washington got them all. So Washington is going to be, of course, the first president after winning the 1788 election. And again, this is a grand experiment. Nobody knows if you can have a democracy, right, that works this way. And you haven't seen a country that was tested in this manner either. But of course, it's still going on today. And some of the first actions of Washington is having Congress pass the Judiciary Act of 1789. This is going to be important because state court decisions can be appealed to federal courts when you have constitutional issues. Remember, in our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, you had no national court system. And even in Article 3 of our Constitution, it doesn't really spell out, other than really having a Supreme Court, none of the lower courts. So this is going to be important in establishing a court system. Washington is also going to have advisors, which are known as his cabinet advisors, and they're going to be very important. He's only going to have 4 members. Certainly you have 15 today, but you're going to have secretaries of state, war, and treasury. War today is now known as defense. And then you have the attorney general, who's heading the Department of Justice. So that's going to be instrumental because he's setting this precedent for future presidents. Now, if you look at, for example, Barack Obama's, this was his cabinet. So today you have everything from transportation, commerce, homeland security, of course, being the latest one. So certainly you have many realms in that area. But the cabinets are the presidential's right-hand men and women who are advising them on key specific issues. So what's interesting about Washington's cabinet is you have some people who are Federalists, in this case Hamilton, and anti-Federalist Jefferson, making up his cabinet. And they're disagreeing in particularly how the nation should be run. And they come about with 2 different plans, and it represents 2 of the earliest political parties that we have, the Federalist Party as well as the Democratic Republicans, or better known with the anti-Federalist community. But Hamilton loves this idea of having a strong national government. He's very much distrustful of the common man. He wants the country to be run by the elites. And he has this very loose interpretation of the Constitution that you should be able to bend it and make it malleable to however they see fit to support the national government. He even supports this notion of having a national bank. We don't have one today, but he was very much a proponent of this. And in terms of the economy, it should be revolving around shipping and manufacturing. So again, you sort of see that this is resolving perhaps, or representing rather, a northern type of economy where you're going to be having manufacturing, you're going to have investors, some landowners. You don't really see so much of a role for agriculture. Contrast this with Jefferson's plan. He sees that there should be more of a balanced approach between the shared power of the national and the state government. He wants a country more based on agrarian principles or agriculture, a country run by farmers and tradespeople. On the other hand, he's fearful of the elite. He's fearful of a dictatorship coming about. And he's also saying that there should be a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, that it should not be malleable. It should be, if it's not written in the Constitution, well, then you don't have that power. Whereas Hamilton's like, well, we could sort of twist these words and have a broad interpretation of it. Well, for Jefferson, no way. And he's completely dead set against the national bank. He says it's not specified in the U.S. Constitution. And as I said earlier, he wants an economy based on farming. He's going to favor the common man, the average farmer, particularly in the South. So you have two competing plans. And again, this is going to set up the two political parties, the Federalists, who want a strong central government, and the Democratic Republicans, who favor more of state power. It's important to note, George Washington never joined a party, but curious to think as which one would he join, if you think. So, one thing that's going to happen in 1794 is there is going to be a rebellion known as the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is this uprising by whiskey distillers. And they're angry over federal tax on whiskey production. They're refusing to pay, and they're even beating federal agents. So Washington is actually able to put down the rebellion by sending in troops. And the big idea about this is not that there was a rebellion, but that the federal government could put down the rebellion. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, with Shays' rebellion, they were unable to do so. So that shows sort of an early test that, hey, maybe this Constitution's working. And then in terms of the national bank, it's ultimately going to be created, even though the Democratic Republicans believe it's unconstitutional. And it's going to be important in terms of unifying the economic structure of the nation. Another important point to make here is that the District of Columbia is going to be set aside for the construction of a new national capital. The idea here is that if you have this particularly set of land that's not favoring one state, that it could be sort of this neutral territory. And it's established right in between Maryland and Virginia, in that it won't necessarily be beholden to a particular state, and a state couldn't have undue influence, and that's why it's carved there. That's why Washington, D.C., until the 23rd Amendment, could not even vote in the presidential elections. In fact, with Washington, D.C., you have taxation without representation, ironically, because they do not have a senator or a member of the House that represents them. So this is certainly new, because the previous capitals were in New York and Philadelphia. So again, to create this neutral area. But not to mention that, you look at perhaps Virginia, having a number of early presidents early on. Perhaps did Virginia have a little bit more of an influence? Certainly debatable, and something to talk about. And then on our last slide here, after Washington's term, and certainly there's more to this in foreign policy, but just in a nutshell, the Washington farewell address is beyond important to read. One of the things he's going to be talking about, unity between the states as he's departing. He's going to really uphold the Constitution's integrity, that it's this framework that needs to be abided by. He's warning against political parties. He sees them as divisive. Well, certainly, right, in the 21st century, you have a lot of divisiveness between today's Republicans and today's Democrats, absolutely. He's also going to say to this new nation, steer clear of foreign entanglements and don't make alliances, because Europe's always getting into wars. You don't want to be dragged into that. And he's also going to note that 2 terms for a president. And what's interesting is that is nowhere in the Constitution until much later in the 20th century with the 22nd Amendment. So he's, going to set a number, because he's the first one. He's the trailblazer of this new nation. He sets a number of precedents and has a lot of warnings for the American people and the future presidents. And some of them certainly come true, particularly with sectionalism and warning against political parties. But very important that you read the Washington's farewell address, because you can relate it to so many things that are going to be studied.